Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we will be having the topic Understanding the Structure of Sentences. So far, we have largely been concerned with the processing of individual words. What happens after we recognize a word? When we access the lexical entry for a word, two major types of information become available. Information about the word's meaning and information about the syntactic and thematic rules that word can take. The goal of sentence interpretation is to assign thematic rules to words in the sentence being processed who is doing what to whom. One of the most important guides to thematic rules comes from the analysis of the verb argument structure. Hence, verbs play a central role in parsing. To assign thematic rules, at least some of the time, we must compute the syntactic structure of the sentence, a process known as parsing. When we hear and understand a sentence, information about the word order is often crucial. A number of important questions arise about parsing in the human sentence parsing mechanism. How does parsing operate? Why are some sentences more difficult to parse than others? What happens to the syntactic representation after parsing? Why are sentences assigned the structures that they are? How many stages of parsing are there? What principles guide the operation of these stages? What happens if there is a choice of possible structures at any point? At what stage is non-structural, semantic, discourse, and frequency-based information used? This last question is another manifestation of the issue of whether language processes are modular or not. Is there an enclosed syntactic module that uses only syntactic information to parse a sentence, or can other types of information guide the parsing process? Any account of parsing must be able to specify why sentences are assigned the structure that they are, why are biased to parse structurally ambitious sentence in a certain way, and why some sentences are harder to parse than others. It is useful to distinguish between autonomous and interactive models of parsing and one-stage and two-stage models. According to autonomous models, the initial stages of parsing at least can only use syntactic information to construct a syntactic representation. According to interactive models, other sources of information can influence the syntactic processor at any early stage. In one-stage models, syntactic and semantic information are both used to construct the syntactic representation in one go. In two-stage models, the first stage is invariably seen as an autonomous stage of syntactic processing. Semantic information is used only in the second stage. Hence, the question about the number of stages is really the same question as whether parsing is modular or interactive. The goal of understanding is to extract the meaning from the what we hear or read. Syntactic processing is only on one stage in doing this, but it is nevertheless an important one. The syntax that governs the language of thought may be very similar to or identical with that of external language. Studying syntax may therefore provide a window onto fundamental cognitive processes. Different languages use different syntactic rules. English, in particular, is a strongly configurational language whose interpretation depends heavily on word order. In inflectional languages such as German, word order is less important. It is therefore possible that the predominance of studies that have examined parsing in English may have given a misleading view of how human parsing operates. For this reason, an important recent development has been the study of parsing in language other than English. Most psycholinguistics hope and expect that the important parsing mechanisms will be common to speakers of all languages. By the end of this chapter, you should first know the parsing is incremental. Second, understand how we assign syntactic structures to ambitious sentence. Third, be able to evaluate the extent to which parsing is autonomous or interactive. And fourth, understand the importance of verbs in parsing. Fifth and last, understand how brain damage can disrupt parsing. And now let us discuss coping with structural ambiguity. What is structural ambiguity? In other words, it is syntactic ambiguity, grammatical ambiguity. So, structural ambiguity is the presence of two or more possible meanings with a single sentence or sequence of words, as opposed to lexical ambiguity, which is the presence of two or more possible meanings within a single word. It is difficult to discern the operations of the processor when all is working well. For this reason, most research on parsing has been on syntactically ambiguous sentences. In particular, ambiguity causes processing difficulty. Most of the evidence that drives modern theories of parsing comes from studies of syntactic ambiguity rather. There are different types of ambiguity involving more than one word. The simplest are perhaps the marketing ambiguity of example, as you can see on the PowerPoint, which could be interpreted either in the sense or sentence 5 or 6. There are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sentences you can see in our PowerPoint. More complex or structural ambiguities associated with parsing, such as in sentence number 7. What was done yesterday, Boris saying, or flood finishing. Although both structures are equally plausible in sentence number 7, this is not the case in sentence number 8. Many of us would not initially recognize a sentence such as in sentence number 8 as ambitious. On consideration, this might be because one of its two meanings is so semantically anomalous, the interpretation that I looked up and saw a mountain range in the sky flying to a country, that it does not appear even to be considered. But psychology has shown us many times that we cannot rely on our intuitions. Recording eye movements has been particularly important in studying parsing. The bulk of evidence shows that we spend no longer reading the ambiguous regions of sentences than the unambiguous regions of control sentences, but we often spend longer in reading than this ambiguation region. The central issue in parsing is when different types of information are used. This would be a serial autonomous model. Early work on parsing. Early models of parsing were based on Chomsky's theory of generative grammar. In particular, psychologists tested the idea that understanding sentences involved retrieving their deep structure. As it became apparent that this could not provide a complete account of parsing, emphasis shifted to examining strategies based on the surface structure of sentences. Psycholinguistic test of Chomsky's linguistic theory. In Chapter 2, we saw how linguistics describes the syntactic structure of language. Can this approach contribute anything to our understanding of the process involved in producing and understanding syntactic structures? When Chomsky's work first appeared, there was a great optimism that it would also provide an account of these processes. Two ideas attracted particularly interest and were considered easily testable. These were the derivational theory of complexity and the autonomy of syntax. The idea of the derivational theory of complexity is that the more complex the formal syntactic derivation of a sentence, that is, the more transformations are necessary to form it, the more complex the psychological processing necessary to understand or produce. This means that transformationally complex sentences should be harder to process than less complex sentences. This should be detectable by an appropriate measure such as reaction times. The psychological principle of autonomy of syntax takes Chomsky's assertion that syntactic rules should be specified independently of other constraints further to mean that syntactic processes operate independently of other ones. In practice, this means that the syntactic process should be autonomous with respect to semantic processes. Chomsky in the year 1957 distinguished between optional and obligatory transformation. Obligatory transformation were those without which the sentence would be ungrammatical. Examples include transformation introduced to cope the number of agreement between nouns and verbs, and the introduction of do into negatives and questions. Other transformations were optional. For example, the passivization transformation that takes the active form of a sentence that turns it into a passive form. Chomsky defined a subset of sentences that he called kernel sentences. Kernel sentences are those to which only obligatory transformation have been applied. There are therefore the active, affirmative, declarative forms of English sentences. Miller and Mankin in 1964 tested the idea that the more transformation there are in a sentence, the more difficult it is to process. They look at the transformation reaction times to sentence. Participants were told that they would have to make particular transformation on a sentence and then press a button when they found this transformed sentence in a list of sentences through which they had to search. The problems with the psychological interpretation of transformational grammar. The tasks that supported the psychological reality of transformational grammar are all used in direct measures of language processing. If we ask participants explicitly to distransform sentences, it is not surprising that the time it takes to do this reflects the number of transformations involved. However, this is not a task that we necessarily routinely do in language comprehension. Memory measures are not an on-line measure of what is happening in sentence processing. At best, they are reflecting a side effect. What we remember of a sentence need have no relation with how we actually process that sentence. Indeed, other findings that were difficult to fit into this framework soon emerge. In summary, the language processor operates incrementally. It rapidly constructs a syntactical analysis for a sentence fragment, assigns it a semantic interpretation, and relates this interpretation to world knowledge. And that would be all. I hope that you have learned from this topic. Thank you and God bless.